Hello to another issue of the Cool Tools Show and Tell. Our special guest this week is Will Smith. Will, would you like to introduce yourself to our listeners and watchers?
Yeah, I am. I am a podcaster and just a general variety nerd. You may know me from such sites as tested.com. I was the editor in chief of Maximum PC for a long time. I moved away from journalism a few years ago and started a VR company. And these days, during the day, I do communications and help with the game at Stray Bombay, and then at night I podcast and stream and do all sorts of other stuff. So I'm. It turns out I'm pretty busy these days. I don't think as busy as you, Kevin, but I can have aspirations.
Yes, well, it's really fantastic to have you join us. Thank you for taking time from your busy day. And one of the things I know from your heritage is that you are interested in cool tools. And so I'm really looking forward to some of the favorite tools you have these days. What would be the first item on your list?
So the number one on my list this time it's kind of an expensive one, but it's something that I found much more useful now that I have it and have it set up in my garage than I ever expected would be when I was before I had it, and that's a Glowforge. So the Glowforge, for people who don't know, they bill it as a desktop 3D laser printer, but it's a laser cutter with some I would say pretty convenient software. That it turns out once you get good, once you have a laser cutter, everything looks like a project that can be solved with a laser cutter. It turns out. So everything from like cases for little computers that I have around the house, or photo frames, lanterns. I've made a ton of even like papercraft stuff. So like when I have a 9-year-old daughter, when her teacher needs help cutting out a bunch of letters, when she was in kindergarten, needed help cutting out a bunch of letters out of 8 by 11 paper, I just did them on the laser and it took like 10 minutes. I cut them all out. I didn't have to do it with scissors. It was
Right.
delightful.
So give us a sense of how big desktop means in this case.
Okay, so if you're familiar with like a traditional laser cutter, like a Trotec or a
No, let's say we're not familiar with. We have no idea.
Perfect. So it's about let's say 4 feet by 3 feet by about a foot. It's pretty big. It's a tabletop size, but it's not like you don't have to have a forklift come in with a pallet to install it. It's something that 2 people can lift, put in place. You do need to vent it outside, because if you're lasering acrylic or even plywood, you're going to generate smoke that you don't want to have inside your building. I think that they sell a filter that you can hook up to it if you don't have an exterior window or something like that. I just knocked a hole in the side of the garage and put a dryer vent on it, which has actually worked really well.
One of the things that Glowforge is kind of famous for is its software and interface, but it also is a little bit kind of like Macintosh in the sense it's more proprietary rather than open source. And so that there's some constraints built into there. Have you found that to be onerous, or just something you're worth tolerating for, or that there's some benefit to that?
So it's a little bit of both. Part of it is that, so they do some software tricks that are really clever. Like you can take a 1/4 inch, a standard Sharpie, and write on your surface of whatever material you want to cut and put it in there and say, hey, just trace the black line, and it'll cut out the black line, which is like, it means that my 9-year-old daughter has been using the Glowforge for 4 years now. Right. At the end of the day, if I'm building something that requires precision, then I can load it up in Fusion 360 or SketchUp or whatever my CAD program of choice is, and generate SVGs that the software will just read and scale appropriate, scale to the scale that I put in the file, and I can build something that has CAD precision. They don't oversimplify it.
But they're also not requiring that you use their software to generate it. You can take anything, as you said, from Fusion or Tinkercad maybe, or I don't know, SketchUp, and then output it with a standard file, and it'll accept that.
Yeah, if you can export SVGs, you can pretty much use that in the Glowforge. As always, like every tool has some idiosyncrasies that you find over a long period of use. There's it's things like, hey, if you want to have things that overlap, then you have to do them on different layers, or if you want to etch some things and cut some things, then you do them in a different color in the SVG or something like that. But as a whole, I've built my most recent project for that, the little console that Panic made, the makers of Fine Macintosh software for the last 20 years. They made a little handheld, like they call it a 1-bit console. It has a little crank on the side, and it's basically like a Game Boy size thing. And I made just a little clear acrylic case that magnets onto the front of that. And it took me like a couple hours. I scanned the play date. So I used that as the model, traced it in Photoshop, generated the SVGs, and I cut it on the laser and glued it together with some acrylic cement and put some magnets in there to hold it in place. And like it was a really fun, dead simple little project that would have been impossible with traditional tools.
I know that laser cutters at that scale are really good at cutting acrylic and plastic. What's the sort of thickest wood, like a piece of plywood, that you can actually cut?
So 1/4 inch is kind of the high end. It is the thickest I've done. I know that there are some ways that you can put registration marks on both sides of the plywood so that you can flip it and cut it from the other side. I haven't actually bothered with that because the stuff that I'm doing, it's usually easier to just cut 2 1/4 inch pieces and then glue them back together in post. In reality, the stuff that I do most often, 1/8 inch is what is the place that I work for plywood and acrylic. And then like the thing that they don't talk about is paper is pretty easy to use. You need to use magnets to hold it onto the surface so it doesn't blow around because there's a lot of air moving inside the cutter. But like a nice piece of cardstock or something, you can both etch and cut at the same time. And like I made a bunch of like cards with these gorgeous intricate cutouts on them for gifts for people, stuff like that.
Can you cut like vinyl, like a Cricut cutter could cut vinyl? Can you cut vinyl in it?
So vinyl is usually a no, because anything with chlorine anything that exudes chlorine gas when you burn it will etch the mirrors. I think the test generally is light it on fire. If it burns green, that's going to be a no. Also, there's extensive threads in the Glowforge forum and laser cutter forums around the internet that are like, hey, these materials are a bad idea. But like anything natural is safe. Wood, leather, paper, stuff like that. Acrylic is usually good. And that's it. Like even metal and glass. I've etched glass coasters with it before. You have to use some sort of a coolant on it or else the glass cracks. But in reality, all that means is you put a really thin layer of Dawn dish detergent on top and you can cut right through the Dawn. It works great.
While you were in the mode when you were shopping around for a laser cutter and considering the Glowforge, did you seriously consider alternatives? Because there are some Chinese-made laser cutters that have a lot more power for the same amount of money. They're not as easy to use. What was for you the selling point?
So, full disclosure, the founder of Glowforge is a friend. So, but mainly it was my experience with working where I did it tested, knowing folks who have had like prior to the Glowforge, the choice in a sub $3,000 laser cutter was get a cheap Chinese laser and hope that the tube holds out, right? And the experience that friends had with those very lasers was, hey, you're going to spend a lot more time on this than maybe you want especially for my kind of use where I use it once or twice a month, probably. It's not something I'm using every day. I made the choice when they started shipping Glowforges that I wanted to get the more reliable, hopefully more reliable, and it has turned out to be quite reliable device rather than throw the dice on the thing that may or may not work when I turned it on.
And I don't recall, but I think the list price is around $3,000 or something.
I think I bought it for. I think when they did their crowdfund in the beginning, you could get them for $2,500. I think they're $3,000, although they do occasionally run sales, I believe.
Okay.
And then there's the whole other thing is that they do what they call proof grade materials, where you can buy the materials from them and like the printer reads a barcode and knows what the settings are, which is convenient when you're starting out.
Yeah. Okay. Well, fantastic. It's a great suggestion. Thanks. Well, so number 2, what's second on your list?
Number 2. So I think you and I have talked about this before, but I've been a home automation enthusiast since before 3 generations ago, when it was really, really bad and kind of janky, but novel. I built last year a home assistant machine that runs on a Raspberry Pi that's literally stuck up on the wall in my garage. Home Assistant, if you don't know, is an open source project that is run by this. It's I think the widest contributed to open source project I'm aware of.
Wow.
They built so the reason Home Assistant is exciting is they built this plugin architecture. It all runs using Docker on Linux, and each of the plugins basically is a small Docker plugin that individuals can contribute to. So if you have some weird piece of hardware that you want to support, or a weird API that you want to support, you build your plugin, and then it just slots in and it shows up in the repository. Anybody can download it. It's really, really well done, and they've kind of crossed the threshold in the last year where it's become better than any of the commercial alternatives, both in terms of breadth of support in terms of hardware and the complexity of things of automations you can do with it. Oh, go ahead.
Well, the complexities is not usually a problem. It's usually how simple can you get it. That's the real hurdle for most people trying to start off on this.
Well, so having started with Wink and SmartThings and all sorts of different commercial products over the years, the place that I always hit with those was that you would eventually reach a point where you wanted to automate something based on some conditionals, and that's where the commercial products break down, because they do want to make it simple for normal humans. The Home Assistant team has built, I would say, a pretty good interface that lets you do conditionals. And if you want to get real complicated, you can even go in and write Python code or whatever to describe the situations that you run. But their GUI is I think good enough for most people.
So what are 5 functions in your household that you have automated?
Oh, so well, this meeting was on our calendar to record this podcast today, and when the time came, the screen behind me and the lights in the office turned on, so that I was ready to go. Right. When you walk into the bedroom, the lights turn on if it's between such and such time, times when you want to. So if I walk into the bedroom at 11 o'clock when my wife's already asleep, it doesn't turn the lights on then. But if I come in at 6 o'clock when it's dusk, and we live in valleys in Northern California, you want to have a little bit more light in the early evening.
And another one.
Oh, when I pull into the driveway at night, the front door lights turn on automatically. If it's me, if it's somebody else, it doesn't. So I like that one too.
So is that a little fob in your car that's recognizing, or is it reading the plate, or what?
It's using the location in the phone. So it's all tied to location in the phone. My wife, daughter, and I all have devices that tell the machine basically where we are, and it ends up being, like I said, it's one of those things that when I started doing it, I thought, oh, this is ridiculous. Why am I spending all this time on this? And then when we go visit someone someplace else, then you're like, oh, it is really nice not to ever have to turn on or off any lights. And when we travel, the house behaves just the same as when, so people can't tell that we're not here, stuff like that.
Right. Okay.
It's pretty nice.
And so if someone wanted to get started in this, what's the first 2 steps?
So the first step is grab a Raspberry Pi. I think they generally recommend a Pi 3 or newer is the recommendation. So that's I believe a 30 or 40. I don't know about you. I have a box of them over here that I just kind of keep around for projects, but they start around $40. And then put a special version of Linux on there. So they have a pre-built version of Linux that has Home Assistant already running on it. You install that on the card, boot up, answer a few questions, plug it into your network. It will search the network and see what stuff you have on the network. So if you have, say, an Apple TV or a Google Home or things like that, it'll detect Alexa. Them and say, "Hey, we need credentials to do this." But then once you get started, because it all runs on Docker, there's this whole other ecosystem of things you can run on it, like my VPN that lets me access stuff inside my home from outside in the real world runs on Home Assistant now. You can run game servers. If your kids want to play Minecraft or whatever, you can run a Minecraft server on there. Does it integrate with something like Alexa for a voice input? It can, depending on which voice assistant you want to use, the complexity is higher or lower. Google is the most complicated for the Google Assistant stuff. Alexa is pretty straightforward. Siri on iOS devices is pretty straightforward. And if you, they actually also offer a service that supports the Home Assistant project, and it's the way they generate revenue, because it's always important to know how your open source projects are making money. The way they generate revenue is by charging $5 a month to kind of streamline the setup for those voice assistants.
Okay.
And provide a endpoint that doesn't require you doing dynamic DNS or something like that to get to your.
And do you find yourself using the voice assistant very much?
The voice assistant is probably the number one way we interact with the lights in the house. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because the problem with automation stuff is there's always edges. You always hit edges where you need the light on and it doesn't think you need the light on. And that's where the voice is great. You know, when I had a baby and I was carrying a wet baby from the bathroom, and I could say, hey, turn on the lights in here, and it flips
Right,
on.
right. Well, wonderful. That's a great, fantastic suggestion. Home Assistant, is that?
Home Assistant, I think it's I think the URL for that's the software is free because it's open source.
We'll have the links in the show notes, but Home Assistant is the software system. Okay, well, fantastic. So, you're on a roll. How about number 3?
So the third one, I can show and tell here. I bought this one the other day. I've looked at them for ages, and I kind of thought they were goofy. But it's a reusable. It's like reusable canned air. It's a blower. It's a blower for, you know, we're constantly shedding. We have keyboards, we have computers. Everything's filled with dust everywhere. I don't have central air because I live in Northern California. We don't need it. So my house is eternally dusty, and this thing is like a little tornado in a can, and I can use it to blow out the keyboard. I can use it to blow out the fans inside the computer. I don't have to worry about static electricity because it's all nicely grounded inside. And it cost what basically a year's supply of canned air does in my house without blasting a bunch of garbage into the air. So it's a not super complicated, Kevin, this one.
Right. I guess the next evolution would be a cordless version of it.
So I literally looked at the cordless version. I was like, I don't think I want to pay another $40 for the cordless version.
There is a cordless version.
You can. So this is a category that there are a lot of companies in Southeast Asia that just make basically the same thing rebadged. And right. This model, the thing that it comes in this casing was available from 5 or 6 vendors. There also appeared to be a cordless version of it that I didn't pony up the extra $30 for, $40 for.
And this is what's the word of what? Is it controllable? Is it just one setting, or do you have a little bit of a way to manage how forceful it is?
It's straight. It's like a blender. It's 0 to 60. It's either on or it's off.
Okay.
The thing I will say is you have to be careful. So there's 2 things. People, like, if you dust out the inside of a desktop PC or something, you shouldn't use a vacuum cleaner for that because that creates a lot of static electricity and you'll zap your components and bad things happen as a result. You also need to make sure that you block the fans from spinning when you're using this, because the electric motors in the fans can serve as generators and will backflow electricity into your computers or whatever devices that have fans. But it's a really nifty little it's very satisfying. I set the vacuum cleaner up a little bit away from it and blast the dust straight from the machine into the vacuum cleaner. Okay. And yeah. So fill me in on why air moving from that is not static, whereas air moving into and the vacuum is static. How does that work? It has to do with the way a lot of the vacuum cleaners have belts. The modern, like your modern Dyson or something like that, is not going to have a problem, is my understanding. But when you have the rubber belt moving that's working the vacuum, it can generate a static charge on the vacuum itself. And if it's a metal tube to the end, then you can blast.
So it's actually not the air moving; it's actually the belt moving through the air.
It's the mechanism of the vacuum cleaner, is my understanding. But I think it's less of a problem now that we're all using, a bagless vacuum.
Yeah.
I'm still careful.
Okay. And does that have a name? Or do you recommend one or the other, or you just search? What do you search for?
So I went to Amazon on this one and I looked for the one that had the most positive reviews.
Right. And what's it called though? What's the category?
This one is the Sunshine Compressed Air 3.0 Multi-Use Electric Air Duster for cleaning dust, hairs, crumbs, scraps for laptops and computers.
That's the name of it.
I think they were putting a lot of keywords in the name, Kevin.
Yeah, it's an SEO name.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a electric compressed air.
Electric compressed air is what I would say is the category. Okay. This one had a bunch of different tips. It has like a wide tip and a really compressed nozzle tip that gives you like a huge it's a little scary. I'll be honest. I blew stuff off my desk the first time I fired it up. But if you get in there with a little like a makeup brush and that, you'll knock all the crumbs out of your keyboard and it won't look gross anymore.
Okay, great. Fantastic. Okay. So your fourth tool, Will.
The fourth tool I didn't bring in here because it weighs 23 pounds. It is a baking steel griddle that I have on my kitchen.
Steel griddle, and steel again as versus cast iron. Usually griddles are cast iron because they could be seasoned. What's the advantage here?
The benefit is the surface is really, really smooth. So you know how cast iron is often porous, especially modern cast iron. You can get an older, pre-Lodge style cast iron pan that's an antique now, and I think people are actually making them new again, where they mill the surfaces to smooth them out. But the benefit of this is there's two things. There's mass, so it's a quarter of inch thick, 3/8 of an inch thick. And it weighs 23 pounds. So it takes a long time to heat up, but that means when you put your food on there, it has a lot of energy inside the metal. And because it's metal, it transfers that heat very quickly and it's very smooth. So like frying an egg is like 25 seconds on one side, and I flip it for as fast as I can flip it and take it off, maybe 2 or 3 seconds.
Right.
And then you get a perfectly fried egg every single time. It still has a little bit of a seasoning. When I got it, it was, shiny silver metal. Over time, the top has become kind of brown and is starting to blacken. But I use it 4 times a week probably.
And what's the general dimensions? Is it fitting over 2 burners on typical stove?
So they come in multiple sizes. There's a single burner size. There's a 4 burner size. There's the one that I have is, I think they call it the skinny griddle, and it's 20 inches by 11.5 inches. So it's like, it should fit over 2 burners then. Yeah, it lives really nicely on the griddle burner in the middle of my range.
Right.
And it takes like full disclosure, it requires a little planning. Usually I get up and I turn the coffee maker on and I turn the griddle on and I let it warm up for 15 or 20 minutes. So it's at 400 or 450 degrees. It's an excuse to use my infrared thermometer too, if I'm being honest.
So it sounds, you have that kind of diner, surface where they can get hash browns, pancakes, the whole thing, breakfast, as well as, I guess, if you're doing meats.
It'll fit 6 pancakes, no problem.
Right.
I can do eggs for the whole family. I've done a side of bacon on it, although that makes a pretty enormous mess. It has a grease channel, but it's still it's a lot of bacon fat around.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and what does that run approximately?
It's not inexpensive. It is a $200 retail, I think. And
is there a name or a make associated with this one?
So this is the baking steel brand Skinny Griddle. Is this one?
Okay.
Yeah, and this company Baking Steel started out making pizza steels. So you can put the steel in your oven and like you would a pizza stone or something like that. And the benefit again is that you can heat it up way in advance and transfer a lot of heat very quickly to get your pizza done.
And when you say baking, it's baking, not bacon.
Baking, yes, baking. Yes.
Okay. The baking steel. I wonder if you could use it for pizza. If you
can. Yeah. So the backside is smooth, and they specifically say, hey, if you put it in the oven, you can totally use this for pizza, which I have done. They'd be like personal, 11 inches wide is like a kind of personal pie.
A long one. Well, that's really great. Thanks for 4 fabulous tools that we didn't really know about. Well, we heard about Glowforge before, but those other 3 were really new to us. Thank you.
Awesome.
So we'll, in the remaining minutes, tell us what you're kind of really passionate about these days, or a project that you're working on, something you want to share with our audience.
Yeah. I've been podcasting. I've been doing a podcast with my co-host Brad Shoemaker called the Brad and Will Made a Tech Pod for 3-ish years now. It's a single topic podcast usually, where we take something that's not necessarily ripped from the headlines. It's not a news show or anything like that, but we take a single topic that's complicated, like what are the different, how does Bluetooth work? What are the different why does sometimes when I connect to my car, the music sounds great, and why does it sometimes sound like it's coming through a 1930s telephone? And we break down all the different protocols and complexities of these technological topics. We've talked about everything from taking photographs on Mars with one of the operators of the Curiosity hazard cams at JPL, to food technology and a bunch of other things. And then earlier this year, we actually launched our first spin-off show from that called the FOSS Pod, which is about open source projects. We realized, as we were looking at our computers, I'm using OBS and Audacity and a dozen different open source projects on any given day, and a lot of these projects that have been going, especially the ones that have been going for a long time, have quietly supplanted the commercial projects as being the market leaders in terms of features and things like that. And we thought there was an interesting opportunity to talk about, to talk to those creators and talk to the people who maintain those projects and find out what it's actually like to run a project like Home Assistant or OBS or Audacity. And we've done, I think, 15. We just recorded the 15th episode of that this morning. So,
wow. Is that a monthly, a weekly?
It's every other week. So
every other week,
bi-weekly or semi-monthly. I can't remember.
And say the name again.
That's the FOSS Pod, and both of them are available.
How do you spell
that? FOSS Pod, POD.
And FOSS means what?
Free and open source software.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, and they're both available at content.town. You can find one at techpod.content.town and the other at fosspod.content.town.
And so tech is the one that you have been doing for. Is that a weekly as well, or also?
That's a weekly. Yes. So that's a weekly. We have the wonderful community of people who've listened to it and participate in our Discord. And I think I've said this. The Discord community that's sprung up around that podcast is probably my favorite community I've ever participated in. I go into the Discord, I learn something new every day. People are talking about everything from writing open source software to building bicycles by hand and everything kind of in between. And it's a delightful group of people with really disparate interests and skills.
So a lot of people these days have problems with moderation in groups. Why is this group different? What have you done to keep it civil and so positive?
We charge for access, it turns out.
Okay.
So when people have put money in, then it turns out they're, I mean, okay, first off, I'm a little older these days, Kevin. So I think that the audience that comes and listens to the stuff that I like to make are naturally maybe a little older and a little less likely to argue on the internet. But no, like I can't overemphasize the value of charging for access, because it turns out once people put a couple of bucks, even if it's just $2 a month, people tend to they've invested something, and thus they're more invested in the community. So
your podcast is free though, but you're just charging for the Discord access. Is that what it is?
That's it. The podcast is free. As many podcasts have done over the years, we built a Patreon. And when you contribute to the Patreon, you either get access to the Discord at the basic level. There's an additional monthly podcast that we do just for patrons, where we kind of just kind of chat about what we're working on and what's going on. But the main podcasts are always free.
So, Cool Tools has been going on for almost 20 years now. And we've often had this idea proposed of doing something like a Discord, but the challenge for me is that it would require my time. I found that those kinds of things don't work unless the sort of hosts are actually involved. So you say you look forward to participating, which is really fantastic. But how much time do you actually wind up having to invest into those conversations?
So in the beginning, there was probably a fair amount, because part of it is that you want to establish kind of the traditions of the community, right? Like culture. When somebody new joins, then everybody puts some wavy emotes on the welcome message and engages them in conversation. But that now it's become, over the last 2 years that the Discord's been live, it's become a place that I come for entertainment and to learn something now. So
you don't have to you're not playing the party host where you've got to keep people entertained and whatnot.
I mean, I check in on the Discord multiple times a day, and if I feel like people aren't conversing, then maybe I'll give a little gentle nudge. But for the most part, we don't really have moderators. We haven't really needed moderators because people, like I said, have been remarkably well behaved. We do have Discord has this idea of threads where you can kind of spin off a conversation into a semi-private area, and we empowered some of the community members who were interested in helping with that to give them that power, so it didn't just devolve into chaos. But like, that's as close as we have to moderators. Those folks kind of are like shepherds of the conversation more than your traditional forum moderator from the 90s.
And are you going to run FOSS in the same manner, where it's a free podcast and they'll have a paid access to the Discord?
Well, so the FOSS Pod is sponsored by Google's open source group. After we had one of the folks from their team on, they were like, "Hey, we would like you to do this for open source software and showcase cool consumer stuff, so that people are excited about making open source software." So currently we don't have them hooked into the Discord. We're trying to figure out how to integrate those communities, because I don't want to build two separate communities. I want to build one inclusive community. We have to figure out a way to do that that's egalitarian and works for everyone.
Did you say two separate? You mean two separate FOSS communities?
I didn't want to build a Discord for the Tech Pod and then a Discord for the FOSS Pod.
You meant the two in the podcast. Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah. I want to have both of those. We want to have both of those communities feed into each other. So hopefully that we all become better as a result.
Right. Okay. Well, that's fabulous, and inspirational too. I'm really impressed with what you've done, and I know that you were working for a very long time in the VR space. Were you also running a podcast and a Discord on that as well?
So we started the podcast. We started the Tech Pod in 2019, as the VR business was kind of starting to take off. We were doing. We were generating anime. We built a software tool that let people do live 2D and 3D animation using VR hardware. And we were doing a lot of like recorded live in front of a studio audience cartoons, which traditionally pretty impossible to do. It's hard on the animator's wrists.
Right.
The pandemic started in 2020, and unfortunately the live studio audience part of that business kind of it became what was a strength became a detriment. So we shut that down for the most part in 2020, and it's kind of in hibernation now. I don't know. We've got to decide what happens to it at this point. But there was no podcast with the VR business.
All right. Okay. That's what I was wondering. I was wondering if you also had another Discord on that.
No, that's too many Discords. 2 Discords, 2, maybe 3 at the outside.
That's your rule of life.
Yeah, no, like, well, I mean, so Discord's a weird thing. I'm old enough that I grew up on message boards. Like, my early time on the internet was on Usenet and IRC, and then we migrated to message boards. And every time we've migrated, the internet got kind of smaller and smaller and smaller. And I'm really of mixed. I have mixed feelings about Discord, because it's a totally closed ecosystem. You can't, like, Google doesn't see the conversations that happen on Discord. They're not searchable, but at the same time, that privacy makes me feel much more comfortable sharing, in my public persona, because everybody knows who I am, and I can engage in a different way in the private space than I would maybe if it was on Twitter or Usenet or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just heard recently that there was some kind of fairly technical communities that were moving off of Slack onto Discord.
I have startup friends who are using Discord instead of Slack because their screen sharing and video chats are better. Yeah.
So Discord is another tool, by the way, maybe the 5th cool tool here. So, well, thank you, Will. This has really been great. It's really great to catch up with you. It's been a while since we chatted, and thank you for sharing your cool tools. I really appreciate it.
It's always a pleasure, Kevin. Thank you so much for having me. And I can't talk to you soon, I hope.
We're glad that you enjoyed this issue of the Cool Tools Show and Tell. Just want to remind you that we have some other coolish material on our YouTube channel here. Please subscribe, comment, like. In addition, this Cool Tools Show and Tell is also available in an Audible podcast form. You can subscribe to it wherever you subscribe to other podcasts if you just wanted to listen. And if you're listening, know that there is a visual version of this on our YouTube channel where we're actually showing the tools, and there's a little bit more of a visual component there. In addition, the same folks that put us, the Cool Tools website out, we also put out a free newsletter every week. It's very, very short. It's 1 page or less. We recommend 6 very brief items that are very succinct, easy to read. You can deal with it in a couple minutes. And every week we bring to you the 6 cool things that we have uncovered and want to share. And it's called Recommendo with 1 M, recommendo.com. You'll be able to find it there. It's free. Join 50,000 plus other subscribers every Sunday morning. You'll get it in your email box. And it's actually one of the most popular things that we produce. But we do produce other newsletters as well. One of them is called What's in Your Bag. We have one that goes out to tools and tips for your workshop. So you can get those at our website, and they're also free. And finally, I want to mention the fact that we do have a Patreon, and this podcast and this vidcast are supported by Patreon supporters. The minimum is $1 a month. And for that, you get an email to ask us anything. We'll respond and answer your question if we're able to. There are other higher levels. You can all see those at our Patreon page. And all those links are below right here. So thank you again for being a fan. And we'll keep producing stuff if you enjoy it. Thanks. We are grateful for all our Patreon supporters. And this week's include Randy Fisher, Bob K., Hans Reisbeck, Michael Douglas, Andrew Nepley, Chris Wurstyuk, Dan O'Brien, Michael Jones, Chris Wayland, and Pamela Cooley. We give thanks to each of you and appreciate your support. Thank you.